The real reason you became a loner, it's not what you think. Loneliness does not come from having no people around one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. Carl Jung famously made this distinction, and it may hold the key to why you feel different from the crowd. If you have found yourself pulling away from society lately, it isn't because you are broken, and it isn't simply because you are antisocial. It is often a sign of a profound internal shift, a necessary step toward what Jung called individuation. You are not just isolating, you are incubating. In this video, we are going to uncover the spiritual necessity of your solitude and how to use this time to build a self that is unshakable. Before we begin, if you believe that your solitude is a strength, not a weakness, please like this video and comment, "I am finding myself," below. Let us journey into the wisdom of the introverted soul. 1. Loners are not born. They are conditioned in childhood. Loners are not shaped by personality labels or simple introversion. They are shaped by repeated emotional neglect in childhood, often so subtle that no one notices it while it is happening. A child does not suddenly decide to withdraw from the world for no reason. The withdrawal slowly forms when emotional needs are overlooked again and again, when feelings are minimized, when questions go unanswered, when attention is inconsistent, and when love feels conditional. In these quiet moments, the child learns a powerful lesson without anyone ever saying it out loud. Needing too much is dangerous, expressing emotions is unsafe, and relying on others leads to disappointment. Over time, the child adapts by turning inward, creating an inner world that feels more stable than the outside one. What looks like independence from the outside is often a nervous system trained to survive without emotional support. This is where the roots of the loner identity truly begin. As this pattern repeats, the child becomes unusually observant and emotionally alert. They begin to read the moods of adults, sense shifts in energy, and adjust their behavior to avoid conflict or rejection. They learn to be quiet, agreeable, and self-reliant, not because it is their nature, but because it is what keeps them emotionally safe. Praise often comes not for authenticity, but for being easy, mature, or low maintenance. Slowly, connection starts to feel unpredictable, while solitude feels controlled and safe. This is why many loners grow into adults who can move through social spaces smoothly while still feeling detached inside. They may be surrounded by people, yet feel emotionally alone. According to Carl Jung's psychological insight, this creates a shadow pattern. The belief that intimacy leads to loss, that vulnerability invites pain, and that the self must always handle life alone. Yet within this shadow also lies hidden spiritual strength, because enduring emotional absence trains the soul to turn inward in search of meaning. This inward turn often opens the door to spirituality and spiritual awakening, not through comfort, but through longing. Many loners discover meaning through silence, reflection, and solitude long before they ever name it as a spiritual path. While others bond through shared activities or external validation, the loner bonds with their inner world. They ask deep questions early in life. They notice the emotional undercurrents others ignore. They become deeply intuitive, sensitive to energy, and aware of invisible emotional dynamics. However, this sensitivity is a double-edged sword. The same awareness that grants depth also keeps the nervous system on constant alert. Crowds feel overwhelming. Shallow conversations feel draining, and emotional chaos in others feels physically exhausting. Distance becomes not a rejection of people, but a method of self-regulation. Alone time becomes the only place where the body finally relaxes. As adulthood unfolds, the original childhood conditioning continues to shape relationships. The loner may crave connection deeply, yet unconsciously expect abandonment. They may be drawn to emotionally unavailable people because that dynamic feels familiar. They may struggle to ask for help, even when they are exhausted, because the nervous system learned long ago that help does not reliably come. From a Jungian perspective, this creates an ongoing conflict between the persona that appears strong and independent and the inner child that still longs to be seen and emotionally met. Spiritual awakening often begins when this conflict becomes impossible to ignore. Patterns repeat until awareness breaks the cycle. At that point, solitude no longer serves only as protection. It becomes a space of healing, self-listening, and gradual reprogramming of old emotional beliefs. The loner starts to realize that being alone was never proof of unworthiness. It was proof of adaptation. What once developed for survival can slowly transform into conscious solitude, where isolation is no longer rooted in fear, but in self-connection, clarity, and the gentle rebuilding of trust with the world. Comment below. I am healing my inner child. If you're ready to understand your past and step into a stronger, more conscious version of yourself. 2. Emotional needs were rejected, dismissed, or ignored. As a child, you tried to express fear, excitement, sadness, or confusion in the only way you knew how, through your emotions, and instead of being met with understanding, you were told, "You're fine, stop being sensitive," or worse, you were simply ignored. And in those moments, something profound happened inside you that no one noticed, because each dismissal quietly taught you that your inner world was not welcome, that what you felt was somehow wrong, excessive, or inconvenient. And over time, this repeated experience shaped your nervous system to believe that emotions were unsafe to share, that vulnerability was risky, and that being open invited rejection rather than connection. Little by little, you learned to pull your feelings inward, not because you lacked them, but because you were protecting them. And this inner withdrawal became a form of self-preservation long before it ever became a personality trait. And while others learned to process emotions through support and reassurance, you learned to process them alone, in silence, in your own private space, teaching yourself to survive without emotional mirrors, without validation, without anyone explaining that what you felt made sense. And this is how loneliness begins, not as a choice, but as a strategy the soul uses when it realizes no one is coming to meet it where it is. What makes this experience so powerful is that it does not just shape how you relate to people, it reshapes how you relate to yourself. Because when you grow up, learning that your emotions are too much or not important, you begin to question your own inner truth, second-guess your reactions, and minimize your needs. And yet at the same time, you develop an unusually deep inner awareness. Because when your outer world does not reflect you, you are forced to turn inward to understand yourself. And this inward turning is often the first quiet step towards spirituality and spiritual development, even if you did not have the language for it at the time. You did not become distant because you lacked the ability to care. You became distant because you cared deeply in an environment that could not hold that depth. And so your sensitivity learned to armor itself. Your openness learned to observe before it trusted. And your heart learned to stay guarded until safety was proven rather than promised. And this is why solitude can feel comforting rather than empty to you. Because it was the place where you were never told to shrink, where your emotions did not have to explain themselves, and where your inner world could exist without interruption or judgment. And yet the deeper truth is that this pattern does not exist to trap you in isolation forever, but to awaken you to the hidden intelligence within your emotional life. Because once you recognize that your loneliness was formed through emotional neglect rather than personal failure, something begins to shift, and your silence stops feeling like a flaw and starts revealing itself as a space of awareness, perception, and transformation. A space where you no longer run from your feelings, but begin to understand them as guides, teachers, and signals guiding your spiritual development back toward wholeness. 3. Vulnerability became associated with danger. Vulnerability became associated with danger long before you ever chose to be alone. Each time you opened your heart and were met with shame, mockery, silence, punishment, or emotional betrayal, your nervous system quietly rewrote its rules for survival until one unspoken belief settled deep into your body. People are unsafe. Solitude is safety. You did not learn this through logic or conscious choice, but through repeated emotional experience, through moments when being seen felt more dangerous than being invisible, and being open felt more painful than being closed. Over time, your system did not just remember the fear, it organized your entire sense of safety around it, teaching you to relax only when no one could hurt you. This is why being alone may now feel calm, regulated, even empowering, while being emotionally close to others can trigger tension, hypervigilance, or quiet withdrawal. It is not because you are antisocial or broken, but because your body learned that solitude meant control and protection, while connection meant unpredictability and emotional risk. Carl Jung captured this truth when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And for a long time, your preference for being a loner may have felt like personality when it was actually a survival pattern. What once protected you gradually became part of your identity, shifting from "I learned to be alone to survive" into "this is just who I am." Yet beneath this self-image lies the emotional intelligence that helped you adapt. Your solitude is not emptiness. It is a refuge built by experience. The problem arises not because you value being alone, but because the choice was once driven by fear instead of freedom. Over time, this protective structure can quietly limit your ability to receive care, closeness, and emotional nourishment, even as you pride yourself on independence. What looks like strength from the outside can sometimes be emotional self-containment on the inside, where needing nothing from anyone feels safer than risking disappointment again. As spiritual wisdom teaches, true strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the ability to hold it without collapsing. Jung's work reminds us that what we repress does not vanish. It waits in the shadow and shapes our behavior from behind the scenes. Your loneliness, then, is not random. It is meaningful. It carries memory. It tells the story of what you learned about love, trust, and emotional safety when you were still forming your sense of the world. And yet the same mechanism that once saved you can now become the very barrier that separates you from deeper connection. As Rumi said, the wound is the place where the light enters you. And this means the place where you learn to close yourself off is also where awareness, healing, and transformation begin. Through the lens of Carl Jung and spiritual wisdom, you begin to see that your nervous system is not your enemy. It is simply loyal to old information. It learned to equate safety with isolation because, at one time, that equation kept you emotionally alive. But safety does not have to mean solitude forever, and connection does not have to mean danger. The shift begins when you stop judging your loneliness and start listening to it. When you acknowledge that your tendency to walk alone was never weakness, but an intelligent response to emotional threat. In that realization, you reclaim your story, not as a person who is broken, but as someone who protected something sacred inside, something that may now be ready, slowly and on its own terms, to be felt, trusted, and shared again. Are you ready to release the fear around vulnerability and step into true inner strength? If so, comment below. I choose to feel safe. To mark your commitment to this journey of healing and self-discovery. 4. Self-reliance replaced human connection. After hundreds of small emotional rejections that never seemed dramatic enough to be called trauma, the child slowly stops reaching outward, not because they stop needing connection, but because each attempt quietly teaches them that needing others brings disappointment. These moments are subtle missed comfort, ignored feelings, unmet reassurance, but their accumulation reshapes the inner world. What once reached for warmth now turns inward for survival. Learning instead how to self-soothe, how to carry pain alone, and how to depend only on the self. This is where the loner identity is not chosen, but formed quietly and unconsciously as protection. What looks like strength from the outside is often built from emotional necessity on the inside. Self-reliance does not emerge because the child is naturally independent, but because connection becomes unreliable. When vulnerability is repeatedly met with distance, the nervous system adapts, teaching the child that it is safer not to ask, safer not to lean, safer not to hope. Over time, independence becomes automatic rather than intentional, and emotional withdrawal becomes a learned language of safety rather than a personality trait. As Carl Jung warned, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. And without realizing it, many children inherit emotional scarcity rather than emotional guidance. They grow up believing they must regulate their fear, sadness, and confusion alone because no one else consistently does it with them. This is how self-soothing replaces human connection, not as growth, but as compensation. The child does not become emotionally numb. Rather, they become emotionally private, retreating into an inner world that feels more stable than unpredictable relationships. In adulthood, this survival pattern is often misunderstood as introversion, emotional detachment, or mysterious independence. Yet under the surface, the former child still longs for deep connection while fearing its instability. They may crave intimacy, but feel uneasy when it arrives, wanting closeness, yet bracing for disappointment. This inner conflict becomes part of their identity, strong enough to stand alone, but still silently desiring to be met. It is here that spirituality and spiritual awakening often begin to emerge, not through comfort, but through solitude that forces honest self-examination. Because connection was once unsafe, awareness becomes heightened. Loners often develop deep sensitivity to emotional shifts, tone, and subtle psychological undercurrents. They learn to read rooms, moods, and energies because their safety once depended on it. This sensitivity, born from emotional vigilance, later becomes intuition, introspection, and a natural pull towards spiritual wisdom. What began as emotional armor slowly transforms into inner perception. The independent identity continues to shape relationships, often unconsciously. The loner gives deeply, yet hesitates to receive freely. They love sincerely, yet keep part of themselves guarded. Even when connection is offered, the old pattern whispers that dependence leads to loss. Jung's insight becomes clear here. What is not healed remains active in the shadow. The early training in emotional self-sufficiency does not vanish with age. It simply changes form. Yet within this pattern lies the doorway to transformation. Solitude, once a shield, becomes a mirror. The same self-reliance that replaced human connection becomes the foundation for inner sovereignty. Through reflection, self-trust, and conscious awareness, isolation shifts from defense to discernment. What once formed from emotional absence evolves into inner presence, and the individual begins to see that the loner identity was never a personality flaw, but an adaptive response to emotional scarcity, one that now holds the potential for true spiritual awakening rather than quiet survival. 5. Loners become hyper-observers as a survival skill. Growing up in an emotionally unpredictable environment trains you to become a hyper-observer without you ever choosing it consciously. You learn to read moods, micro-expressions, subtle energy shifts, and emotional danger with astonishing accuracy, not out of curiosity, but because, as the truth states, this is not curiosity, it is a defense mechanism. Your nervous system learns that safety depends on awareness, so you scan faces, tones, silences, and reactions instinctively. You walk into a room and feel tension before anyone speaks. You sense when a smile is forced. You notice when the emotional temperature suddenly changes. While others move through conversations casually, you remain alert, quietly tracking everything. What looks like calm observation on the outside is, on the inside, the residue of a childhood where emotional stability was never guaranteed, and vigilance became the price of safety. Over time, this survival skill follows you into adulthood and begins to shape your identity, your relationships, and even your connection to spirituality and spiritual development. You may withdraw, not because you dislike people, but because solitude is the only place where your nervous system fully rests. You may struggle to trust easily, not from arrogance or coldness, but from the deep instinct to protect your inner world before it can be harmed again. This heightened awareness gives you the rare ability to see beneath appearances, yet it also carries the burden of emotional exhaustion. You are always sensing, always reading, always interpreting. Without realizing it, you may begin to believe that being alone is who you are, when in fact, it is simply how you learn to survive. Through Carl Jung's spiritual wisdom, this pattern reflects the shadow of sensitivity, an unconscious adaptation that once protected you, but no longer needs to dominate your life. As your spiritual development deepens, the meaning of this hyper-observation begins to change. What once existed as fear-based scanning can evolve into conscious awareness, discernment, and presence. You begin to understand that your perception is not meant to imprison you in isolation, but to refine your ability to navigate life with clarity rather than constant defense. You start to see the difference between intuition and survival-driven alertness, between healthy solitude and emotional withdrawal. In this awareness, healing becomes possible not by destroying the part of you that learned to observe, but by releasing the fear that taught it to stay on guard. The skill that once kept you safe can now serve your growth, allowing your sensitivity to become a strength guided by choice rather than a reflex ruled by the past. Do you recognize this trait in yourself? Comment with awareness. I see clearly, and I trust my inner vision. 6. The good child. Pattern leads to adult burnout. Many people who grow into loners were once the good child, the quiet peacekeeper who learned too early how to stay out of the way, how to manage emotions instead of expressing them, and how to be low maintenance so they would not become a burden. They were praised for being mature, responsible, and understanding. But what was really happening was emotional self-erasure. As Carl Jung warned, the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of its parents. And for many future loners, that burden became invisible training in emotional survival rather than emotional freedom. As they grow into adulthood, that early pattern transforms into a life of chronic overgiving. You may find yourself giving more time, more care, more patience, and more emotional energy than the people around you ever return. You become the listener, the supporter, the problem solver, the one who holds everything together while quietly running on empty. The imbalance feels normal at first because it mirrors what you learned in childhood. But over time, it creates exhaustion, resentment, and emotional burnout. Relationships begin to feel one-sided, not because you are weak, but because your empathy has been conditioned to flow outward without limits. Eventually, solitude becomes less about isolation and more about survival. You step back, not because you dislike people, but because you are tired of being drained. This is where spiritual wisdom begins to reveal what psychology alone cannot fully explain. You are not avoiding connection. You are protecting your nervous system, your energy, and your inner stability. Carl Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And when awareness arrives, you finally see that your loneliness was not random. It was a response to years of emotional overexertion and unspoken responsibility. With this awareness comes a quiet but powerful shift. You begin to realize that constantly being the good one has costs, and that true connection cannot exist where self-abandonment is required. Solitude becomes a place of recalibration rather than punishment. It allows you to stop bleeding for people who would never bleed for you, to stop over-explaining your boundaries, and to stop feeling guilty for choosing rest instead of sacrifice. Slowly, your energy returns. Your mind grows clearer. Your intuition sharpens. Your identity begins to detach from the role you were trained to play and reshapes into something more authentic. This is why so many loners resonate deeply with Carl Jung's teachings and with spiritual wisdom as a whole. What once felt like rejection reveals itself as discernment. What once felt like isolation transforms into selective connection. You no longer give from obligation, but from choice. You no longer shrink to keep the peace, but learn to let peace exist within you. The path of the loner seen clearly, is not a path of emotional coldness. It is the slow, quiet return to the self after years of carrying what was never meant to be yours. 7. Solitude is not loneliness. It is a conscious choice. Loners do not withdraw from the world because they hate people. They withdraw because being surrounded by emotionally unavailable people feels far lonelier than standing alone. After too many moments of speaking and not being heard, of caring and not being met with the same depth, the heart learns a quiet truth. Constant misconnection hurts more than silence. In that realization, solitude slowly transforms from something painful into something protective. It becomes peace instead of pressure, control instead of chaos, and safety instead of constant emotional risk. When you repeatedly find yourself as the one who listens, understands, and holds space, yet never receives the same emotional presence in return, your nervous system begins to associate connection with exhaustion rather than nourishment. Each shallow conversation, each dismissed feeling, each moment where your vulnerability is met with discomfort or indifference teaches your soul that not every gathering is a place of belonging. Over time, your body reacts before your mind does, tightening in crowded spaces, longing for quiet, not because you fear people, but because you crave emotional honesty. In solitude, something profound begins to happen. Without the noise of other people's expectations, you can finally hear your own inner voice. Without the pressure to perform, explain, or shrink yourself, you start to feel what is real inside you. This is where spirituality quietly deepens, not through grand rituals, but through the simple act of returning to yourself. Here, your loneliness begins to shift into spiritual awakening, because for the first time, you are no longer abandoning your inner world just to avoid being alone on the outside. Being alone allows you to observe your emotions without judgment. You notice how grief rises and falls, how anger dissolves when it is finally acknowledged, how longing teaches you what kind of connection your soul truly seeks. You stop confusing attention with love and proximity with intimacy. You realize that real connection requires emotional presence, not just shared space. In this way, solitude becomes a training ground for emotional clarity and self-respect. Choosing to walk alone for a season is not a rejection of humanity. It is a refusal to keep betraying yourself. It is understanding that healing cannot happen in spaces that constantly reopen old wounds. When you step back, you are not running away from connection. You are stepping out of patterns that taught you to accept emotional crumbs instead of genuine nourishment. You learn that being alone does not make you empty. Staying where you are, unseen, does. As your awareness sharpens, you become more selective. You no longer chase belonging at the cost of your peace. Instead, you start to recognize energy, depth, and sincerity. You learn the difference between people whose presence feels like grounding and those whose presence feels like turbulence. Through this discernment, your boundaries strengthen, your intuition becomes louder, and your self-trust grows steadier. What once looked like isolation reveals itself as a transition. The loner is not broken. The loner is in between worlds, between who they were when they tolerated emotional neglect and who they are becoming through truth and clarity. In this space between, solitude serves as both shelter and mirror, helping you remember who you are when no one is watching, and teaching you that peace is not found in numbers, but in alignment. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss more spiritual wisdom like this. And if choosing solitude has empowered you, comment below. I honor my path of conscious solitude. 8. Being a loner is survival intelligence, not a flaw. Being a loner is not a flaw, but a form of survival intelligence shaped by early learned emotional sovereignty. The quiet inner knowing that you do not need to chase connection blindly, depend on others to feel whole, or abandon yourself just to be accepted. You understand intuitively that not every connection nourishes the soul, that some relationships drain more than they give, and so you choose depth over chaos, alignment over approval, and truth over temporary comfort. This is a strength that forms when you realize early in life that belonging is meaningless if it requires self-betrayal, and that wholeness is not something another person can hand you. It is something you construct from the inside out through clarity, boundaries, and self-respect. Because of this, your solitude becomes a place of restoration rather than punishment, a space where your identity forms without noise, where your values sharpen without pressure, and where your inner voice grows louder than the expectations of others. Your path teaches you to read energy more than words and intention more than appearance. And this sensitivity allows you to move through the world with quiet accuracy, understanding quickly who is safe, who is chaotic, and who only wants to take more than they give. You do not isolate because you dislike people. You step back because you sense the emotional cost of staying in the wrong environments, and you choose peace even when others misunderstand your distance. This is emotional sovereignty in action, the ability to regulate your own feelings, hold your own ground, and remain whole even when the world around you feels unstable. Through this, your spirituality deepens because solitude becomes the gateway to self-awareness, intuition, and inner strength, guiding you towards spiritual development that grows naturally when you are no longer dependent on external validation. As you walk this path, your experiences teach you the power of self-protection without fear, self-connection without loneliness, and self-respect without compromise. Your quiet independence is not the result of coldness, but the result of having learned too young what it feels like to carry yourself when no one else could. It is the wisdom of someone who knows that emotional safety is more valuable than social approval. And the more you grow, the more you realize that this way of being has given you 3 essential truths: that choosing yourself is not selfish, but sacred. That true connection only begins when you meet others from a place of wholeness rather than need. And that emotional sovereignty is the foundation upon which real peace is built. Through these lessons, your solitude becomes not a wound, but a source of power proof that you have learned to survive, evolve, and rise without losing yourself. To conclude, do not fear your time alone. While society calls it loneliness, wisdom recognizes it as freedom. By withdrawing from the noise of the collective, you are giving yourself the space to hear your own intuition and integrate your shadow. You are not separated from the world. You are simply becoming whole within it. Support our mission by liking this video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Please subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom and turn on notifications to join us for more deep dives into the human psyche. Thank you for being here. How to respect yourself in front of toxic people. As Carl Jung once said, what you resist not only persists, but grows. And when it comes to toxic people, the greatest act of resistance is not fighting them. It's respecting yourself enough to rise above their chaos. In today's video, we'll explore powerful principles that help you protect your energy, stand firmly in your truth, and walk through life with dignity, even in the presence of negativity. As you listen, think about a moment when you lost a bit of yourself trying to please the wrong people. What lesson did it teach you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your experience might give strength to someone who needs it today. 1. Toxic people. Trigger your shadow, not your worth. Toxic people do not expose your worth. They awaken your unconscious wounds. The anger, shame, and defensiveness that rise in you during these encounters are not evidence that you are weak or broken, but signals from parts of you that were once hurt and never fully healed. What feels like an attack on your identity is often a collision with your shadow, the hidden emotional landscape shaped by past pain, rejection, and unmet needs. Their behavior may feel personal, but in truth, it is rarely about you. It is about what lives unresolved within them and what still echoes unresolved within you. Their cruelty is most often a projection of their own inner struggle. People who carry unhealed pain tend to offload it onto others because they lack the awareness or courage to face it within themselves. When someone belittles, manipulates, or disrespects you, they are often acting from fear, insecurity, or long-standing emotional wounds they have not dared to confront. What they accuse you of may reflect exactly what they cannot accept about themselves. Once you recognize this, you stop absorbing their words as truth and begin to see them as reflections of a broken inner world that has nothing to do with your real value. Your emotional reaction, however intense, is not proof of weakness. It is a message. When a toxic person triggers you deeply, it is because they have touched a familiar wound. Perhaps their tone mirrors a voice from your past that made you feel small, unworthy, or invisible. Perhaps their rejection stirs a long-standing fear of abandonment. Your body reacts before your mind can reason, revealing exactly where healing is still needed. This is how painful interactions become guides for spiritual awakening, showing you the hidden places inside that still seek compassion, safety, and self-validation. True self-respect does not come from trying to win against toxic people. It does not come from proving your worth, defending every accusation, or shrinking yourself to avoid conflict. It comes from the quiet realization that your value does not require permission from anyone who is emotionally blind. When you stop explaining yourself to those committed to misunderstanding you, you begin to reclaim your dignity. When you stop internalizing their chaos, you break the old loop of self-doubt that once controlled your reactions. As your spirituality deepens, your responses shift. You no longer meet toxicity with explosive emotion or silent self-betrayal. Instead, you learn to pause, to observe what is being stirred inside you, and to respond from awareness rather than instinct. You begin to notice when your impulse to please, defend, or withdraw is rooted not in the present moment, but in old emotional survival patterns. This awareness creates space between stimulus and response, and within that space, self-respect is born. Boundaries become acts of self-honor rather than emotional weapons. You learn that walking away is not weakness, silence is not defeat, and distance is sometimes the most loving choice you can make for your own nervous system. You realize that you do not need to convince a toxic person of your worth, because your worth was never in debate. It was only your belief in it that was once shaken. In this way, toxic people no longer dominate your sense of self. They become mirrors, unintended teachers who reveal where your shadow still lives and where your light is now strong enough to heal it. Through awareness, restraint, and inner grounding, you stop reacting from wounded identity and start living from conscious self-respect. Your worth becomes something you carry within you, untouched by projections and anchored in a deeper understanding of who you truly are. 2. Self-respect begins with non-reaction. Self-respect begins the moment you learn to pause instead of reacting. Because in that brief space of stillness, something powerful happens and you quietly take back control of yourself. When you do not react immediately, you are no longer being pulled by someone else's emotional hook. And real self-respect is revealed not through fighting back, but through choosing consciousness over impulse. Mastery is born in the invisible space between emotion and action, where you decide whether your energy will be ruled by instinct or guided by awareness. Toxic people thrive on reaction because reaction gives them power, attention, and influence over your inner state. They expect your anger, your defense, your emotional turbulence, because that is how they confirm their importance in your world. But when you remain calm, when you do not rush to explain, argue, or prove yourself, you quietly shut down the entire mechanism they rely on. This is not avoidance, and it is not weakness. It is emotional self-leadership. You are no longer handing over control of your nervous system to someone who thrives on disturbance. Through spirituality and spiritual development, you begin to understand that true power is not loud or forceful. It is steady, grounded, and unshaken. Silence becomes strength when it is chosen consciously, not out of fear. Stillness becomes authority when it is rooted in self-worth. Each time you choose non-reaction, you reinforce your inner boundaries without needing to announce them, and you teach your nervous system what safety inside yourself truly feels like. When you stop reacting automatically, you start responding deliberately, and this shift changes the entire way you move through the world. Your emotions no longer run you. You begin to guide them. This is not suppression. It is sovereignty. You are no longer denying your feelings, but you are no longer enslaved by them either. You observe them, regulate them, and decide consciously what deserves expression and what does not. Toxic people often become unsettled by this shift, not because you confronted them, but because you detached your emotional investment. They feel the loss of access before they understand it. You did not raise your voice, but you raised your frequency. You did not set loud boundaries, but you embodied them. This is one of the quiet miracles of spiritual development. You evolve internally, and the outer dynamics simply reorganize themselves around your new center of gravity. As you continue this practice, you begin to recognize how often you once gave your power away without realizing it. How many times you allowed someone else to decide your mood, your tone, your self-image, and even your peace. Through conscious non-reaction, you reclaim authorship over your inner world. You stop outsourcing your emotional climate to unstable environments, and instead, you cultivate stability from within. This inner stability slowly becomes unshakable certainty. You feel less need to defend yourself. You lose the urgency to explain. You no longer seek validation from people who arrive carrying chaos. Self-respect becomes less of a concept and more of a lived state. It settles into your posture, your voice, your breathing, and your decisions. You speak differently because you no longer need to convince. You walk differently because you no longer need to chase. Eventually, you realize that reacting was never strength. It was conditioning. Pausing, however, is discipline. Awareness is refinement. And calm is not passivity. It is precision. Toxic people cannot manipulate what they cannot emotionally disturb, and they cannot disturb what no longer reacts. This is where your real power lives, in the breath before the answer, in the silence before the impulse, in the stillness that replaces the old reflex to justify, argue, or collapse. Every time you choose that pause, protect your energy as part of your spirituality, and govern your reactions as part of your spiritual development, you are not losing power. You are steadily reclaiming it. Comment below. I choose calm and self-respect. If you are ready to stop reacting and start protecting your inner peace. 3. Separate your identity from their attacks. Their words only wound you when you begin to identify with them. And this is the quiet truth that changes everything when you are dealing with toxic people. You are not their criticism, not their anger, not their frustrated interpretation of who they think you are. The moment you detach your ego from their judgment, their attacks lose their power, because you stop feeding their words with your identity. Carl Jung taught that much of what people project onto others comes from their own unconscious wounds, fears, and unresolved shadows. And when you understand this, you stop taking their attacks personally. You start to see that what they say often reveals far more about their inner conflict than about your worth. As Jung's wisdom echoes through spiritual wisdom traditions, what truly harms you is not what is said, but what you believe about yourself in response to what is said. And the moment you refuse to merge your self-worth with their opinion, you remain whole even in the middle of their negativity. When you no longer identify with their words, something shifts inside you at a deep emotional and physical level. Your nervous system calms, your breath steadies, and your reactions soften, not because you become weak, but because you become anchored. You are no longer fighting for validation, and this inner stability is what truly unsettles toxic people, because they lose access to the emotional control they once had over you. Marcus Aurelius captured this truth when he said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. And this power comes alive the moment you realize that no one can define you without your consent." Respecting yourself in front of toxic people is not about arguing, defending, or proving anything. It is about standing quietly in the knowing of who you are and allowing their words to fall away without embedding themselves in your identity. The deeper your spiritual awakening becomes, the clearer you see that peace is not found in changing others, but in mastering your inner response to them. This is where Carl Jung and spiritual wisdom meet at their deepest point, because individuation, becoming your true self, requires that you pull your identity back from every label, insult, or projection that was never yours to carry. When you stop accepting emotional burdens that do not belong to you, you become emotionally untouchable, not because you feel nothing, but because you are no longer controlled by what comes from outside. You remain intact in your silence, steady in your presence, and grounded in your truth. The more you practice this inner separation, the more your self-respect grows naturally, and the less power toxic people have over your emotions, your choices, and your sense of self, because your identity is no longer built on their approval, their moods, or their judgments. 4. Do not mirror toxicity. Responding with the same energy as a toxic person may feel like strength in the moment, but in truth, it traps you in a shadow-to-shadow battle where no one truly wins. When you mirror their aggression, their manipulation, or their emotional chaos, you are no longer acting from clarity. You are reacting from the very darkness they live in. This is why refusing to mirror their behavior is not weakness at all, but a profound spiritual act of power. It is the moment you step out of unconscious reaction and into conscious self-direction. Calm, clarity, and dignity do more to dismantle toxicity than any argument ever could, because toxic dynamics only survive when both sides continue to feed the loop. When you choose calm instead of retaliation, something subtle but powerful happens. You disrupt the pattern the toxic person depends on. They expect emotional feedback, anger, defensiveness, fear, or desperation, because that is the fuel they use to control the situation. The moment you withhold that fuel, the fire begins to die on its own. Your calm becomes a silent boundary, a signal that you are no longer available for manipulation. In the language of Carl Jung, this is the moment you refuse to be possessed by the shadow. Instead of letting your unconscious wounds take over, you remain anchored in awareness. This is where spirituality stops being a concept and starts becoming a lived experience. And this is also where spiritual awakening quietly deepens, not through confrontation, but through self-mastery. Clarity follows naturally when you stop reacting emotionally. You begin to see the situation for what it truly is, not through the fog of anger or hurt, but through grounded perception. You recognize that toxic behavior is not about you. It is an expression of the other person's unresolved inner conflict. When you no longer personalize their actions, you no longer feel the urge to defend your worth through emotional battles. Instead, you protect your energy by staying clear. This clarity dissolves confusion, weakens manipulation, and restores your inner authority. You are no longer pulled into proving yourself. You simply stand in your truth, and that alone changes the entire dynamic. Dignity is the final piece that causes the toxic loop to collapse. Dignity means you do not lower yourself to meet someone in their chaos. It means you speak when necessary, remain silent when appropriate, and walk away when the situation demands it all without hatred, fear, or the need for revenge. Dignity is quiet, but it is unstoppable. When you maintain your dignity, you communicate something stronger than any insult or comeback ever could. You show that your self-respect is not negotiable. In that moment, the power dynamic shifts completely. The toxic person loses leverage because their greatest weapon, your emotional reaction, no longer works. In this way, refusing to mirror toxicity becomes an act of deep psychological and spiritual intelligence. You are no longer fighting the person in front of you. You are freeing the self within you. Each time you choose calm over chaos, clarity over confusion, and dignity over degradation, you are training your nervous system to recognize safety in self-control rather than in emotional survival. This is how true self-respect is built, not by winning arguments, but by refusing to participate in cycles that diminish your spirit. And this is the hidden power behind spiritual awakening. The realization that your peace is more valuable than your pride, that your awareness is stronger than their dysfunction, and that the greatest victory is not domination, but liberation. Don't forget to subscribe for more spiritual wisdom on protecting your energy, mastering self-respect, and rising above toxic behavior. 5. Boundaries are an act of self-love. Boundaries are an act of self-love. And when you stand in front of toxic people, this truth becomes a form of spiritual clarity, because setting boundaries is never a punishment. It is protecting your soul, preserving your wholeness, and reminding yourself that you do not need to explain, defend, or justify what keeps you emotionally safe. A boundary is simply a line that separates what nourishes your spirit from what drains it. And this is where spirituality and spiritual development become practical. Because real growth is not just about being kind. It is about being clear, firm, and rooted in self-respect. Toxic people thrive in environments where you over-explain, over-give, and silently tolerate disrespect. So when you begin to hold your ground, they may test you, not because you are wrong, but because your new strength threatens their old control. Yet true boundaries do not need aggression or anger. They need steadiness. They need the courage to say no without guilt, to step back without apology, and to protect your energy without fear of judgment. Every time you choose silence instead of reacting, space instead of arguing, or calm instead of chaos, you interrupt the cycle that toxic people rely on because they feed on confusion and emotional instability. Boundaries bring both of those to an end. At first, this shift feels uncomfortable, especially if you were raised to please others or avoid conflict. But discomfort is simply the growing pain of becoming whole. Your voice becomes firmer, your posture becomes stronger, your presence becomes sharper, even your silence gains weight. Toxic people sense this before they understand it, and that is why they resist. Not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are no longer someone they can manipulate. This is the moment Carl Jung's teachings reveal themselves in your daily life, because he believed that what you allow from others often reflects what you have yet to heal within yourself. So when you set a boundary, you are not just protecting your outer life, you are integrating your inner world, especially the shadow that once feared rejection, abandonment, and disapproval. The deeper your spiritual development grows, the more you realize that love without limits becomes self-betrayal, and limits without hatred become self-mastery. Boundaries teach you that forgiveness does not mean returning to harm. Kindness does not mean allowing disrespect. And peace does not require silence in the face of mistreatment. Some people will be upset with your boundaries, not because you are unkind, but because they were benefiting from your lack of them. That is why the journey feels lonely at times. But loneliness is often a sign that you are leaving the wrong places, not losing the right people. With each boundary you set, your nervous system relaxes, your clarity increases, and your emotional energy becomes protected rather than scattered. You stop asking, "What will they think of me?" and begin asking, "What do I think of myself when I allow this?" And that question becomes your compass for every relationship in your life. The message that remains is simple but transformative. Self-respect is not measured by how much you endure, but by how intentionally you choose. Your energy is sacred and deserves protection. Distance can be an act of love. Silence can be a form of strength. And every boundary you honor is a step toward healing, power, and authentic spiritual development. 6. Conscious silence is supreme strength. Conscious silence is not weakness. It is complete psychological control. Because the moment you no longer feel the need to defend yourself, explain your choices, or prove your worth, the toxic person instantly loses access to your energy. And this is where true self-respect quietly begins. Toxic people survive on reaction, on emotional chaos, on pulling others into endless conflict where they can dominate the narrative and drain your strength. But when you meet them with calm awareness instead of emotional resistance, you shut down the very system that feeds their behavior without ever raising your voice. In that silence, you are not shrinking. You are standing so firmly in your identity that their words can no longer reach your core. Carl Jung's spiritual wisdom teaches that what remains unconscious controls us, but what becomes conscious sets us free. And conscious silence is exactly that moment when you refuse to act from old wounds, old triggers, and unconscious reactivity. You are no longer trying to be understood by someone who benefits from misunderstanding you. And this is where your power quietly returns to you. Marcus Aurelius captured this truth when he said, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." And that strength becomes visible the moment you stop explaining your boundaries to people who are committed to crossing them. You begin to understand that you do not owe emotional access to those who misuse your trust. And you do not owe clarity to those who distort everything you say. Silence at this level is not avoidance. It is mastery, because avoidance is still fear, while mastery is standing in complete inner control without needing to prove anything to anyone. Toxic people seek endless conversations, endless justifications, and endless emotional battles where you slowly give your authority away. But conscious silence sends a message stronger than any argument ever could. You no longer define my reactions, my mood, or my worth. Eleanor Roosevelt said, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." And that consent is most often given through reaction, not through words. When you remove your emotional response, you remove their leverage. Through the lens of Carl Jung and spiritual wisdom, this silence is where individuation begins to solidify. Because you stop performing for approval and start living from internal authority. You no longer speak from the wounded child seeking validation, but from the grounded adult who chooses peace over ego. When you reach this level of emotional sovereignty, toxic people begin to feel uncomfortable around you because they can no longer manipulate your nervous system, provoke your insecurities, or program your emotions. Your calm becomes a mirror that reflects their own instability back to them. And this is why silence unsettles those who thrive on chaos. Silence is not passive. It is deliberate restraint. It is choosing not to bleed your truth in rooms where it will only be used against you. And it is choosing not to argue with people who gain power from misunderstanding you. Your peace becomes more valuable than being right, and your energy becomes more sacred than being validated. As this practice deepens, your confidence no longer depends on being heard. Your identity no longer depends on being approved. And your worth no longer depends on being defended. You begin to move differently, speak less, observe more, and act with quiet authority rather than emotional urgency. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss powerful insights like this. If you're ready to practice conscious silence and reclaim your inner strength, type in the comments, "I choose calm over chaos." 7. Self-respect is built through small daily choices. Self-respect is never built in dramatic scenes or loud moments of victory. It grows quietly through the small, ordinary choices you make when no one is watching. Every time you pause instead of reacting, walk away instead of arguing, choose peace over validation, and protect your identity instead of your ego, you are strengthening the inner structure that holds your life together. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And this truth becomes clear when you face toxic people. They do not destroy you with one big event. They drain you through a series of temptations to react, to defend, to prove, to explain. Yet your power grows each time you resist the pull toward chaos. Pausing instead of reacting is one of the simplest yet most transformative acts of self-respect. Toxic people thrive on emotional explosions because your reaction gives them fuel, attention, and the illusion of control. When you pause, you reclaim your nervous system from their influence. You teach your body that you no longer dance to someone else's emotional rhythm. This pause becomes a doorway into deeper spirituality because silence allows you to see the truth beneath the surface. Not everything deserves your energy. Not everyone has earned a reaction. And not every situation requires you to abandon your inner peace. In that stillness, your spiritual awakening begins not with mystical visions, but with the simple realization that you can remain centered even when someone tries to pull you off balance. Walking away instead of arguing is not weakness, it is wisdom. Arguments with toxic people are never about finding clarity or solving problems. They are about creating confusion, shifting blame, or dragging you into emotional mud. When you walk away, you do not lose. You simply refuse to participate in a game designed to exhaust you. You choose dignity over chaos, and this act of leaving becomes a statement about who you are becoming. It shows that your time is valuable, your peace is sacred, and your emotional energy is not available for people who twist your words to feed their ego. Walking away strengthens your identity because it teaches you that self-respect is not proved through battle, but preserved through boundaries. Choosing peace over validation is another profound act of inner liberation. Toxic people often try to control you by keeping you desperate for their approval. They want you explaining yourself, defending your intentions, or proving your worth. But when you choose peace, you stop looking to broken people for confirmation of your value. You no longer seek reassurance from those who benefit from misunderstanding you. This is the moment you step into the spiritual maturity Carl Jung described, where your sense of self comes from within, not from unstable opinions. Peace becomes your compass, not validation. and you begin to move through life with a quiet strength that does not beg to be seen. Protecting your identity instead of your ego is where true transformation begins. Ego reacts. Identity remains rooted. Ego seeks to win. Identity seeks to stay aligned with truth. Ego wants to dominate. Identity wants to stay authentic. When toxic people try to provoke you, it is often your ego that wants to respond, defend, or retaliate. But your identity, your soul, your essence, understands that not every battle is meant to be fought. Choosing identity over ego is a spiritual discipline because it forces you to ask, who am I being right now? Instead of shrinking to match someone's dysfunction, you rise to match your own values. Through these daily, subtle choices, self-respect becomes a living practice. You change not by force, but by intention, not by fighting toxicity, but by refusing to let it shape your behavior. And as these choices accumulate, something irreversible happens inside you. Your boundaries become stronger, your reactions become calmer, and your presence becomes more grounded. What once triggered you no longer touches you. What once controlled you can no longer reach you. And this is the quiet, powerful sign of a true spiritual awakening when you finally realize that self-respect was never about controlling others, but about mastering yourself. If you find this content touching your heart, please consider becoming a member to receive more in-depth lessons and direct support from me. In the end, respecting yourself in front of toxic people is not about winning arguments or proving your worth. It's about knowing your value so deeply that no one can shake it. As Carl Jung reminds us, when you become conscious of who you truly are, you stop allowing others to define you or drain your energy. Choose boundaries over guilt, silence over chaos, and dignity over emotional battles. If this message resonated with you, please like the video, share it with someone who may need this reminder, and subscribe to Spiritual Wisdom for more deep insights into self-growth and inner strength. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming videos.